Crowds have gathered in Havana ahead of a service to remember the former Cuban leader Fidel Castro. Foreign leaders have also paid their respects and are expected to attend the memorial ahead of Castro's funeral on Sunday. But the White House has just announced that President Obama will not be sending a US delegation. Castro is one of the most divisive figures of the last century, hailed as a revolutionary who stood up to the United States and condemned as a brutal dictator. To discuss this, we're joined by Richard Gott, author of Cuba, A New History, and Douglas Murray is a journalist for The Spectator and associate director of the think tank, the Henry Jackson Society. Hello to you both. Thank you for joining us on Sky News this evening. Richard, to you, first of all, how should we view him?
Well, I think he was one of the most remarkable figures of the last century. And he was a really great man. He ruled for more than 50 years. He was, I think one should call him a socialist autocrat. He certainly controlled things very firmly, but he was a very benevolent fellow.
Douglas?
No, history will remember him as one of the more minor 20th century dictators, but a dictator nonetheless, a brute, a thug, a megalomaniac, somebody who overthrew one non-democratic regime and then forgot to hold a general election ever again in the country he claimed to be freeing. It'll remember him as all sorts of very bad things indeed, but I just think it's been fascinating for the last few days to listen to the flotsam and jetsam of the losing side in the Cold War, extolling Castro for, health service improvements in Cuba and so on, and all the time having to, unfortunately, cover over and forget the firing squads and the murder of political opponents and the torture of those who disagreed with him and so on. It's a very uncomfortable position, I think, that the pro-Castro element finds itself in, but that's what comes from being on the losing side of history.
Richard?
Well, I think that's complete rubbish, so I'm not going to even contemplate discussing it. Castro was an extraordinary man. He wasn't a minor figure. He was one of the major figures of the last half of the 20th century. He was a great third world leader. He didn't get on with the Americans or with the Europeans, but he did get on with all the third world countries, particularly in Africa and in Latin America. And there his memory will be held high for many, many years to come.
Douglas, complete rubbish, you're talking.
Well, I would expect to hear that from Richard Gott, who, of course, was an agent of influence of the KGB during the Cold War and thus very clearly on the wrong side of history himself. But really all it is that Castro himself provided a rallying point, undoubtedly a rallying point, for everybody and anybody who was anti-American. He was lucky in his choice of enemy. He was lucky that the Bay of Pigs invasion went so badly wrong. He was lucky that he could present himself in this light and then cover himself in the veneer of being an ongoing revolutionary and so on. I mean, this was just sheer rank opportunism from him. And of course, there are people who hated America during the Cold War, hate it still today, who have to, as I say, extol this man and extol him despite all of the grotesque human rights abuses he carried out, and make excuses for him and try to come up with reasons other than his anti-Americanism, which they can claim to admire.
Richard, your problem is you're on the wrong side of history, apparently.
Yes, maybe. But
no doubt
I think
about that.
It's very reasonable to have been anti-American for the last 50 years. After all, think of what successive American presidents have done during the period in which Castro was trying to establish a reasonable government in his island. Going back as far as the Vietnam War, but I don't suppose Douglas remembers that. But
no, I don't remember the Vietnam War, but I do remember, as I say, that you had to even leave your job at The Guardian because you were outed as an agent of influence of the KGB. So it's not like listening to a normal critic, is it? It's like listening to somebody who worked for the SS talking about the Nazi rule in Germany in the 40s. So this isn't at all an independent view that you're giving. You're giving the warped KGB view of history.
Let's try not to be too personal about each other and play a little bit cooler and talk about what's happening as far as Fidel Castro is concerned. Who is going to the funeral? Who isn't? And what we should read into that. The two superpower leaders, if we still can call Russia a superpower, are not going. I wonder whether young Monsieur Trudeau will go or not. I'm sure that you read, Richard, his comments over the weekend. Were you surprised?
Not at all, no. I mean, Trudeau père got on very well with Fidel, and I think the young Trudeau has said that he won't now go. I think the Cubans will be quite disappointed that nobody important has gone from Russia or from the United States. I think they will be sad about that, but I'm sure a lot of people from other parts of the world will attend.
I wonder, sorry, Douglas, you were going to say, I interrupted you.
I was going to say, of course, Fidel Castro was one of only 3 world leaders who went to the funeral of Pierre Trudeau, Justin Trudeau's father. And so there's obviously, as there was shown in Trudeau's statement on the death of Castro, an enormous amount of warm feeling from the Canadian Prime Minister towards Castro. But of course, Trudeau made such a fool of himself over the weekend by talking about Castro in these slavish terms, talking about what a wonderful orator he was and so on. It led to this huge trend on social media, apart from anything else, saying eulogies that Trudeau would give. You know, Stalin, in Trudeau's view, would have been probably reviewed posthumously as somebody who massively increased tourism in the Siberia region and so on. There aren't very many world leaders, certainly not of free countries or democracies, who would want to be seen in Havana for the funeral of Fidel Castro. That's because they wouldn't want to be seen in any way backing up such a thug and sadist and murderer and political despot.
Okay, let's look forward before we let you go, gentlemen. We appreciate you taking the time to talk to us today. Richard, you first of all, what now for Cuba?
Well, I think they will, sort of gradually change. It's a little bit difficult because we don't quite know what line Donald Trump will take. He may take the line of Douglas Murray, and goodness knows what will happen if he was likely to take control. But I don't think Douglas Murray has got much chance.
Okay, Douglas?
Well, I don't particularly want to have any chance. But all I can say is that I'm very glad, Richard, that you and your friends at the KGB and the Russians, the Soviets in the Cold War didn't win. And I'm very sorry that people like you remain, after you lost the Cold War, lamenting it so much that you have to provide excuses for the last bits of flotsam and jetsam from your failed ideology.
You know what? We're going to keep you two apart. Thank you very much indeed for joining us on Sky News this afternoon. Thank you.
You didn't frankly have the balls to put country before party.